And important for receiving feedback, developing goals, is maintaining a growth mindset. And I'm sure many people are aware of what growth mindset versus fixed mindset are, so I'll just review it briefly here. Fixed mindset being that you believe success is driven by innate ability, and perceiving failure as a negative statement, and rejecting things like constructive feedback. And so thinking that you failed at something, that's a very negative portrayal of you, and then thinking that you'll never kind of be good enough is a growth mindset. I'm sorry, is a fixed mindset. And then on the other side of things, the growth mindset is kind of believing that success comes from hard work, learning, training, more learning, and that failure actually results in more learning. That learning actually comes from failure. And so this can empower you to seek feedback, be more receptive to constructive feedback, and incorporate that feedback into your daily performance. And a representative statement of this could be like, I learned from my failure and I'll be better because of that failure. And I know none of us are entirely fixed mindset or entirely growth mindset. Most of us are somewhere in between. But the more qualities of growth mindsets that we can incorporate into our lives, into our practice and learning, we'll be better off because of it. And so, important to this feedback conversation and receiving feedback is being active about seeking feedback. There've been some studies about this, and actually learners are more likely to improve if they actively are involved in identifying their weaknesses, making learning goals, and working on these goals with their teachers. And some examples of specific language that can be used when asking someone if they can kind of have a feedback conversation with them. Say you're working with Dr. Greenberger, you could ask, oh, Dr. Greenberger, is there anything different I could be doing to improve on my presentations or something else? Or if you want to set aside some time to talk about it, Dr. Greenberger, I was wondering if we might be able to schedule 5 minutes for feedback on my presentations today or tomorrow after you listen to them on rounds. I'd be happy to come to your office or another spot that's convenient for you. And when meeting for feedback, the faculty or residents will usually start the conversation. But if you're not having your questions answered, or you want to talk about certain things, be prepared with some directed questions, like like I was working to broaden my differential diagnosis today in my presentation. How do you think it went? What could I improve even more for tomorrow? And so getting at the emotions of feedback is hard, especially modifying feedback or constructive feedback that can be kind of construed as negative. And it can be hard going into these feedback conversations, thinking that you'll receive some constructive feedback that can that can hurt. And that's feedback is intimidating. It's a very normal feeling. I think as humans, it's part of human nature to avoid situations where you're being told, things that you're doing wrong or things that are less desirable. But in our training in becoming competent physicians, this is a really key part of our growth. And ideally, we would be receiving this feedback, especially constructive feedback or modifying feedback, from someone that we already have a relationship with, someone that we trust, and someone that we know has our best interests in mind. But this can be tricky with our the rotations. We have such short time that we work with each attending, so it can be tough. And then there's also this balance of too much positive feedback versus too much modifying feedback. There's actually in business literature, there's an optimal ratio of positive to modifying or negative feedback, and it's 4-to-1. So you get 4 positive things said about your work for every 1 modifying thing said about your work. Interesting, in couples counseling, that ratio is actually 10 to 1. But if you receive too much modifying feedback, the learner feels crushed if they think they can't do anything right. But if you receive just too much positive feedback and not enough modifying feedback, the learner will think, oh, this person doesn't have anything new to tell me. They don't have anything to teach me. I'm just going to kind of tune them out and not listen to them. And so it's a balance. It's a balance. And modifying feedback can be hurtful. It can be crushing. It can feel really bad. And so there's a few tips for receiving that modifying feedback is to, 1, be in a growth mindset. 2, don't get defensive. 3, thank them for bringing it up. And then asking the person if you can check back in with them in a few days to see if you've implemented those changes that they suggested. And this presentation would not be complete without a conversation about systemic bias as well. Bias is out there. Race, gender, sexuality, personality, personal background or experiences. It's bias is innate to human nature, and there are some institutional level things that institutions do to minimize the effect of bias. There are trainings, there are analyses of evaluations to analyze for sources of bias. And then, moving away from human assessment and towards assessment based on clinical outcomes or clinical competencies can help too. But those, the caveat there is that those are also not completely bias-free. And even removing all the bias, there are still things like, other non-biased things that contribute to learning environment that are at play, like stereotype threats. That has also been shown to affect performance. And so I think, on a personal level, while we continue these conversations about rooting out bias in feedback and evaluations, I think it's important that we all kind of take a part in contributing positively to the learning environment as well, and thinking about how we can impact it, how we can include our fellow learners, help make them shine. And some examples to do this are, including fellow learners in conversations that they're feeling left out of, or changing the subject so that you include other learners, reporting microaggressions, or telling, the attending if they misgendered someone. And so preparing for the future, I think it was an important part of this talk to talk about the, residency. There will be residency. Residency has teaching expectations and as well as learning. And so a little bit about how to effectively deliver feedback for, on your part, for you delivering feedback to your future students. So feedback, just reviewing, is specific non-judgmental information used to improve performance. And then there's a difference between formative and summative feedback. Formative feedback being, it's based on single events, it's in the moment, and it has the goal of improvement. So say you're working with a student, you go in and see a patient with them, and you watch the students talk to the patient and see how they interact with them, tell them what's going on with their medical issues, and you give feedback right after that encounter to help them, to tell them how they did and what they can improve on. Summative feedback is a summary of multiple events. It's planned and it's at the middle or end of the rotation. And this has the goal not so much of improvement, because the rotation's either like midway or almost over. It has the goal of evaluation. It's saying, how did you do during that whole thing, right? Ideally avoid really broad general questions like, how do you think the rotation went? How do you think you did? These are really not specific, and ideally you'd approach it with something more specific that really helps the students. And so a nice framework to approach these conversations with is art. ask, reflect, tell. And so the ARTS framework for feedback is, so ask, like at the beginning of the rotation, you told me that you wanted to improve how you interview new patients for their history and physical. Then maybe the student responds, mentions how they think they did, such as if they got lost in their train of questions, forgot to ask a set of questions, or couldn't keep the conversation on topic. And so then reflecting back, it sounds like you forgot to ask some questions and the resident had to jump in and fill the gaps. Do I have that right? And then telling the learner what you think. I agree that you missed a few questions. That's very common among learners. You can add some modifying feedback in here. I think you can continue to improve in the order you ask questions, not jumping around so much between how the patient felt yesterday, then to family history, then back to how they felt yesterday. Unless the patient brings up family history at that point. And then having kind of like a systemic order that you're going through things that you want to ask the patient, and going, making sure that you're hitting on all the questions that you want to hit on. And then asking, how do you think you could continue to improve on this? And so wrapping this up, some take-home points. So think feedback conversations instead of giving feedback. Use SMART goals. They're goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. Maintaining a growth mindset and actively seek feedback are very helpful, and they both go very much hand in hand. Advocate for reducing bias and do what you can to make your peers shine. Give timely and effective feedback as future educators. And consider using the ARTS framework, ask, reflect, tell, when delivering feedback to learners. So thanks so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I hope it helps you this upcoming year and in the future. Please reach out with any questions, and good luck this year. And here are my references. All right, thanks.